Chapter 21 of The Dog Crusoe and His Master. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Today's reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Dog Crusoe and His Master by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 21. Wolves attack the horses, and Cameron circumvents the wolves. A bear hut in which Henry shines conspicuous. Joe and the natter list. An alarm. A surprise and a capture. We must now return to the camp where Walter Cameron still guarded the goods, and the men pursued their trapping avocations. Here 7 of the horses had been killed in one night by wolves while grazing in a plain close to the camp, and on the night following a horse that had strayed was also torn to pieces and devoured. The prompt and daring manner in which this had been done convinced the trader that the white wolves had unfortunately scented them out, and he set several traps in hope of capturing them. White wolves are quite distinct from the ordinary wolves that prowl through the woods and plains in large packs. They are much larger, weighing sometimes as much as 130 pounds. But they are comparatively scarce, and move about alone or in small bands of 3 or 4. Their strength is enormous, and they are so fierce that they do not hesitate, upon occasions, to attack man himself. Their method of killing horses is very deliberate. 2 wolves generally undertake the cold-blooded murder. They approach their victim with the most innocent-looking and frolicsome gambols, lying down and rolling about and frisking pleasantly until the horse becomes a little accustomed to them. Then one approaches right in front, the other in the rear, still frisking playfully until they think themselves near enough, when they make a simultaneous rush. The wolf which approaches in rear is the true assailant. The rush of the other is a mere feint. Then both fasten on the poor horse's haunches and never let go till the sinews are cut and he is rolling on his side. The horse makes comparatively little struggle in this deadly assault. He seems paralyzed, and soon falls to rise no more. Cameron set his traps towards evening in a circle with a bait in the center, and then retired to rest. Next morning he called Joe Blunt, and the 2 went off together.
"It is strange that these rascally white wolves should be so bold when the smaller kinds are so cowardly," remarked Cameron as they walked along.
"So 'tis," replied Joe. "But I've seed them other chaps bold enough too in the prairie, when they were in the large packs and starving."
"I believe the small wolves follow the big fellows and help them eat what they kill, though generally they sit round and look on at the killing."
"Hist!" exclaimed Joe, cocking his gun. "There he is, and no mistake."
There he was undoubtedly, a wolf of the largest size, with one of his feet in the trap. He was a terrible looking object, for, besides his immense size and naturally ferocious aspect, his white hair bristled on end, and was all covered with streaks and spots of blood from his bloody jaws. In his efforts to escape he had bitten the trap until he had broken his teeth and lacerated his gums, so that his appearance was hideous in the extreme. And when the 2 men came up, he struggled with all his might to fly at them. Cameron and Joe stood looking at him in a sort of wondering admiration.
"We'd better put a ball in him," suggested Joe after a time. "Mayhap the chain won't stand sich tugs long."
"True, Joe. If it breaks, we might get an ugly nip before we killed him."
So saying, Cameron fired into the wolf's head and killed it. It was found, on examination, that 4 wolves had been in the traps, but the rest had escaped. 2 of them, however, had gnawed off their paws and left them lying in the traps. After this, the big wolves did not trouble them again. The same afternoon a bear hunt was undertaken, which well nigh cost one of the Iroquois his life. It happened thus. While Cameron and Joe were away after the white wolves, Henry came floundering into camp, tossing his arms like a maniac, and shouting that 7 bars was down in de bush close by. It chanced that this was an idle day with most of the men, so they all leaped on their horses and taking guns and knives sallied forth to give battle to the bears. Arrived at the scene of action, they found the 7 bears busily engaged in digging up roots, so the men separated in order to surround them, and then closed in. The place was partly open and partly covered with thick bushes into which a horseman could not penetrate. The moment the bears got wind of what was going forward, they made off as fast as possible, and then commenced a scene of firing, galloping, and yelling that defies description. 4 out of the 7 were shot before they gained the bushes. The other 3 were wounded, but made good their retreat. As their places of shelter, however, were like islands in the plain, they had no chance of escaping. The horsemen now dismounted and dashed recklessly into the bushes, where they soon discovered and killed 2 of the bears. The third was not found for some time. At last an Iroquois came upon it so suddenly that he had not time to point his gun before the bears sprang upon him and struck him to the earth, where it held him down. Instantly the place was surrounded by eager men, but the bushes were so thick and the fallen trees among which the bears stood were so numerous that they could not use their guns without running the risk of shooting their companion. Most of them drew their knives and seemed about to rush on the bear with these, but the monster's aspect, as it glared round, was so terrible that they held back for a moment in hesitation. At this particular moment Henry, who had been at some distance engaged in the killing of one of the other bears, came rushing forward after his own peculiar manner. "Ay, that is it! Hi! De bar no go under yit?" Just then his eye fell on the wounded Iroquois with the bear above him, and he uttered a yell so intense in tone that the bear himself seemed to feel that something decisive was about to be done at last. Henry did not pause, but with a flying dash he sprang like a spread eagle, arms and legs extended, right into the bear's bosom. At the same time he sent his long hunting knife down into its heart. But Bruin is proverbially hard to kill, and although mortally wounded he had strength enough to open his jaws and close them on Henry's neck. There was a cry of horror, and at the same moment a volley was fired into the bear's head, for the trappers felt that it was better to risk shooting their comrades than to see them killed before their eyes. Fortunately the bullets took effect and tumbled him over at once without doing damage to either of the men, although several of the balls just grazed Henry's temple and carried off his cap. Although uninjured by the shot, the poor Iroquois had not escaped scatheless from the paw of the bear. His scalp was torn almost off and hung down over his eyes, while blood streamed down his face. He was conveyed by his comrades to the camp, where he lay 2 days in a state of insensibility, at the end of which time he revived and recovered daily. Afterwards, when the camp moved, he had to be carried, but in the course of 2 months he was as well as ever and quite fond of bear hunting. Among other trophies of this hunt were 2 deer and a buffalo, which last had probably strayed from the herd. 4 or 5 Iroquois were round this animal, whetting their knives for the purpose of cutting it up, when Henry passed, so he turned aside to watch them perform the operation, quite regardless of the fact that his neck and face were covered with blood which flowed from 1 or 2 small punctures made by the bear. The Indians began by taking off the skin, which certainly did not occupy them more than 5 minutes. Then they cut up the meat and made a pack of it, and cut out the tongue, which is somewhat troublesome, as that member requires to be cut from under the jaw of the animal, and not through the natural opening of the mouth. One of the forelegs was cut off at the knee joint, and this was used as a hammer with which to break the skull for the purpose of taking out the brains, these being used in the process of dressing and softening the animal's skin. An axe would have been of advantage to break the skull, but in the hurry of rushing to the attack the Indians had forgotten their axes, so they adopted the common fashion of using the buffalo's hoof as a hammer, and the shank being the handle. The whole operation of flaying, cutting up, and packing the meat did not occupy more than 20 minutes. Before leaving the ground these expert butchers treated themselves to a little of the marrow and warm liver in a raw state. Cameron and Joe walked up to the group while they were indulging in this little feast.